Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'm going to be doing my first ever Big Brother What If video, and to mirror what I did with Survivor, here I'm going to be talking about what if every Final 2 was a Final 3. Now, obviously with Big Brother, every season has a Final 2, so we will be talking about every season of Big Brother here, obviously outside of BB1 come on. I also decided for this video we will also be including Celebrity Big Brother 1 and 2 as well, just because it's like, when else am I going to talk about those seasons? So obviously we will be talking about the scenario where the game ended at the Final 3, and we'll be talking about how the juries would have voted. I will be keeping the juries of BBs 2 and 3 the same as at that point in Big Brother history. Everyone voted, and we're going to keep that the same here. From BB4 until BB14, where we had 7-person juries, I will be adding the last pre-juror onto the jury in order to keep that 7 number there. However, after that, once we get to 9-person juries, I will not be adding any members to the jury, because with Final 3s, an 8-person jury is actually more ideal than a 9-person jury. Obviously, because you can avoid a 3-way tie, so I will be keeping the jury at 8 for those. So with that setup done, let's get started with BB2. In BB2, we obviously have Will and Nicole as the actual Final 2. Here we will add Monica into the Final 3, and I am inclined to think Monica wins this Final 3. Now, if we're looking at the jury votes, I think all 3 of these people have locked votes. I think Will definitely has Shannon, and he definitely has Boogie. Nicole definitely has Hardy, and I'm pretty sure she has Autumn. And then I do think Monica for sure gets Krista. So at that point, we're at 2 to 2 to 1. There are 3 other members of the jury. We have Cheryl, we have Kent, and we have Bunky. I'm inclined to think Cheryl votes for Monica. Monica was one of the few people that did not vote out Cheryl. Cheryl supposedly had a close relationship with her. So I am inclined to think that she votes for Monica. That makes us have a 2 to 2 to 2 tie, where essentially Kent and Bunky decide the winner. Obviously, in the original season, Kent did vote for Will. Bunky did vote for Nicole. However, in this scenario, I could very likely see Kent going and putting his vote on Monica. And I do think if this changed, it would change because of the ability to watch the show. Because Kent was not a big Will fan within the season, but by the time of the jury vote itself, he didn't hate Will. I think a lot of that had to do with him being able to watch Will on TV. However, I do feel like Kent was also really annoyed by Will's final jury speech, so I would say that he would vote for Monica. And at that point, do we get a 3-3-2 tie, or does Bunky also flip and go to Monica? I'm not 100% sure. If we do get Will essentially picking the winner, I really don't know who he picks, to be honest, because I don't think he liked any of them. I do think Will takes Nicole to the end, but not because he liked her more necessarily, but more so because he thought he could beat her. But also, I think he was closer to Nicole throughout the season, but also didn't really like Nicole that much. So, I don't know. It's really up in the air. I'm inclined to think that Monica probably wins this in a 4 to 2 to 2 vote, but there is a chance of a tie, and with that, I guess we would go to Survivor rules where, again, Will picks the winner. I don't know who he picks, but let's just say that Monica wins this scenario. Now for BB3, where obviously we have Lisa versus Danielle, and then we add in Jason. To be honest, I think Lisa wins unanimously in this scenario. Obviously, in the actual scenario that we got in the real season, Jason was the only person to vote for Danielle. However, in this scenario, Jason's in the Final 3, and I just don't see where either of them get votes from, as so much of the jury was pretty anti Danielle and Jason by the end of the season and voted for Lisa as like the outsider of that. So I'm very much inclined to think that Lisa wins unanimously here. I mean, technically Jason could probably get votes from like an Amy, maybe a Kiara, but even then not really, maybe a Roddy. I don't know. Like I really don't see where the votes come from. So for me, I think Lisa wins unanimously here. Now from BB4, where this is actually a pretty interesting scenario. We have June versus Allison. We obviously add in Robert, and I think Robert easily wins if he gets to the Final 2. But in a Final 3 scenario, I do think that really shakes things up, especially because now we're going to add David onto the jury, and I really don't know where this jury vote goes. I do think we have 3 locked votes for Robert. I do think Dana, Justin, and G are all pretty locked votes for Robert in this scenario. It's really a question of where do the other 4 votes land. We do have Nathan, who I do think votes for Allison. So really that leaves a 3-person contingent of Jack, Erica, and David that pretty much decides the game. I mean, I think they could tie it up for June if they do vote for June, and through that Allison gets to pick the winner and she does pick June. Or they could put their votes on Robert, and through that Robert would win. I don't know where it goes. To be honest, I'm kind of inclined to think they vote for June. I mean, I don't know about David. Really, David's jury vote is the biggest question mark to me. I don't think he likes any of the people that were here at the final 3, so I don't know where his vote goes to. But by the time that Erica left, I do know that she was pretty pro-June. But at the same time, she also had the relationship with Robert, so I think that could go either way. I know Jack was definitely more pro-June than probably anybody on the jury. So, I mean, I do think June could squeeze that one out, getting that 3-person vote, and through that Allison decides to give the win to June. But again, this one's very much up in the air. I mean, Robert really only needs one more vote to win, and I do think there are chances that he gets that, especially from someone like an Erica. Now for BB5, and here we do get Drew and Michael as the final 2. We do add in Diane, and in this scenario, I am inclined to think Diane wins this jury vote. If we're looking at the jury, we do add in Jace. And to be honest, Michael might actually have a good amount of votes here. And to be honest, that might be the saving grace for Michael. Actually, to be honest, this is a travesty if we really want to talk about it. But Michael very likely could get enough votes to win here. It's very much up in the air. Obviously, like with Drew, Michael, Diane, I actually think Drew gets no votes in this scenario because I think all the votes that went to Drew would go to Diane. However, due to Diane not being on the jury and being replaced by Jace, this is actually pretty bad for her, as I do think this could get the jury vote to go onto Michael. Because let's look at the votes. I mean, I think Will, Karen, and Marvin are locked Diane votes, while I think Michael has the locked votes of Jace and probably Nokomis. So in turn, essentially, the twins are deciding the game, Adria and Natalie, and I think they could vote for Michael, which means in this final 3 scenario, Michael wins in a 4-3 vote, which would be a travesty, but I think that's probably what would end up happening. Now for BB6, where this one's a bit complicated as well, we do have Maggie, Yvette, and Janelle. And again, this is another scenario where the final pre-jury member really shakes things up. Because in a final 2 scenario, I don't think Janelle wins against either Maggie or Yvette. However, in a final 3 scenario, with Kaser being added to the jury, I think Janelle could actually pull this one off. So again, if we look at the actual jury votes, I do think we have people like April and Jennifer who are locked Maggie votes. We have Bo and probably James who are locked Yvette votes. James definitely being a bit more hesitant there, as I do think he could vote for Janelle, but I do think he leans Yvette at this point in the season. And that means the remaining votes come from Howie, Rachel, and Kaser, who I think are locked Janelle votes. So essentially, Janelle wins in a 3-2 vote, unless the friendship can come together and put their votes on one individual person, which would give one of those members the win. But it's like, is that going to happen? But even then, James could vote for Janelle and outright give Janelle the win also. So I do think this is actually a scenario where Janelle could win a jury vote, which wasn't very likely in an actual final 2 scenario. Now for BB7, and kind of a similar thing, where again, Kaser gets added on to the jury, and I think through that, Janelle could actually beat Boogie here, because I think if it was a final 2 of Boogie versus Janelle, I do think Boogie wins. That gives Janelle a lot of leverage here, because Janelle easily gets the votes of Howie, Kaser, and Marcellus, while I do think Boogie gets the locked votes against of James, Danielle, and Will. That essentially makes Chicken George the deciding vote here, and I do think he votes for Janelle. But again, it is a little bit up in the air. I do think George, by the end of the season, talked about how he wanted to respect the game, but it's like, I wouldn't be surprised if he did think Janelle played the better game. So it is up in the air, but I do think Janelle probably pulls that one out as well. Now for BB8, we have Dick versus Danny versus Zach, and I mean, Zach wins. In this scenario, Kale gets added to the jury, which to be honest doesn't really affect much. I mean, Zach gets the locked votes here. Well, I mean, this is actually the tough thing, because like, does America's Player still come into effect? Because if America's Player still comes into effect, Eric is going to be forced to vote for Dick and being forced to campaign for Dick, which might change things up. But I think naturally, if these people had voted the way that they wanted to, I do think Zach gets the votes of Dustin, Amber, Jamaica, Jessica, and Eric. 5 votes there. While I do think Jen probably still votes for Danny, I do think at that point in the season she had gained some sort of respect for her. And then we have Kale, who's kind of all over the place. I think she could vote for really any of them. I don't think she's opposed to voting for any of them. But really, it doesn't really matter. I do think Zach naturally wins. Again, if Eric is forced to campaign for Dick, that could change some things, particularly his and Jessica's votes. But at the end of the day, I do still think Zach has the votes to win the game there. Now for BB9, where we have Adam versus Ryan versus Sheila, and we do add in Allison onto the jury. And this one's, again, very much up in the air. I know a lot of people say, oh, Sheila would have won if she got to the end. I don't really see that being the case. I do think it's a scenario that could happen, but I don't think it was a likelihood. If we look at the votes here, I think Adam has some locked votes here. I think he has the votes of Matt and Natalie. I think Ryan has the locked vote of Joshua and Allison, while Sheila, I don't think she has any locked votes. I mean, the other three members of the jury who essentially decide the game are Sharon, Chelsea, and James. Now, I'm inclined to think that they vote for Adam, especially Chelsea and James. I mean, James is very close to Adam. Considering James also got into this big argument with Sheila, I am inclined to think James and Chelsea vote for Adam. I think Sharon could vote for Sheila, but I don't think it's a super good likelihood that Sheila wins anyway. I do think Adam still wins this final jury vote, though there is a chance Sheila could win if she can get the votes of James and Chelsea. Now for BB10, and this is kind of a weird scenario too, because obviously we have Dan and Memphis, but then they add in Jerry into the final three, and then we do add in a jury member of Jesse. And I do not know where this goes at all. I mean, I think Dan obviously has some locked votes. I think he has Rennie. I think he has Keisha. I think he probably has Libra, but that's only 3. I think there are some votes that are very much up for grabs there. I mean, again, Jesse, Ollie, April, and Michelle, I do think vote as a block, and they decide the winner. And I think they could vote for Jerry if they wanted to. Really, Dan just needs one more vote, and I think it is possible that he gets that vote, especially from someone like a Michelle, who he really buttered up through his luxury comp, but it's definitely not secure. I don't think Dan is for sure winning this final 3 scenario. Again, if it was a final 2, I do think Dan wins, because I do think he gets the vote of Memphis, and at worst he wins 4-3. But in this scenario, Jerry could get the votes due to the inclusion of Jesse from the jury. But again, I am still inclined to think Dan probably wins, but there's definitely a chance for him to lose. Now for BB11, where we do have Jordan and Natalie, we obviously add in Kevin, and we also add in Ronnie as the final jury member. And this is another one that's up in the air. I mean, we still get America's vote, I guess. I guess Shima doesn't return, so Jordan gets that vote. I do think she also has the locked votes of Michelle and Jeff, which is 3 votes already. So really, Kevin needs to sweep the rest of the votes. I do think he gets Jesse, Lydia, and Russell's votes. So essentially, it becomes a 4-3 vote with Ronnie as the deciding factor. And I don't know who Ronnie votes for. I definitely think there is a good chance he votes for Kevin, especially because the rest of his alliance is voting for Kevin at the end. But it's definitely not secure. Again, I think he could vote for Jordan. I think he could also... Actually, no, he's not voting for Natalie. But still, it's like there's definitely room to maneuver there. Again, another scenario that isn't super solid. I don't 100% know what happens here, but I'm inclined to think that Kevin does win this jury vote. Now for BB12, where we have Hayden and Lane, and we obviously add in Enzo. I don't think this changes too much. I think Hayden still wins in a 4-3 vote, if not even a 4-2-1 vote. In this scenario, we add in Kristen to the jury, who I think is an absolute locked Hayden vote. I think Hayden still gets the votes that he got last time. I do think he gets Kathy, Reagan, and Matt. That's enough for him to win. I think the only real change that could happen here is that Brendan and Rachel could vote for Enzo over Lane, but outside of that, I think Hayden still wins. It doesn't really change the result here. Now for BB13, which could have been an interesting scenario, but I don't think it really plays out that way. But either way, we have Adam part of the final 3, and we add in Lawan as part of the jury. This doesn't really change much. I think the jury votes still play out exactly the same. I think Rachel still gets the votes of Brendan, Shelly, Jeff, and Jordan, while Portia probably gets the votes of Danny, Kalia, and now Lawan, as Lawan again was anti-returning player and it was also aligned with Kalia and Danny. So I do think that's the most likely scenario, but again, doesn't really change the end result. Now for BB14, and this could be interesting too. Here we do add in Danielle onto the final 3, and we add in Mike Boogie as part of the jury. I do think Ian still wins here, obviously, but I do think there are some votes that are up for grabs. Obviously, Dan does not get a vote in this scenario, but I do think Danielle could get some votes. I do think Ian has the locked votes of Brittany. I think he has Boogie. And to be honest, through Boogie being on the jury, I do think he can convince Frank in order to vote for him, while otherwise I do think Frank could be a Danielle vote. But I do think Danielle gets the locked votes of Jen and Shane. Ashley is probably an Ian vote, which leaves us with Joe. Joe didn't like Ian, but voted for Ian over Dan. I don't know if he liked Danielle either. I could very much see him voting either way. Like, I'm inclined to think that probably Ian still wins this jury vote, especially considering Boogie could convince Frank to vote for Ian. I do think Ian still wins, though I do think the vote is a lot closer than a lot of people would give it credit for. Now from BB15, again, from this point forward, we will not be adding people onto the jury, as again, 8 people juries are better than 9 for final 3s. So we do have a final 3, though, of Andy, Gina Marie, and we add in Spencer. I think Andy still wins the game here, though obviously it's a 6-2 vote instead of a 7-2 vote, but I really feel like the votes are exactly the same. I don't think anyone votes for Spencer, while Aaron and Judd probably still vote for Gina Marie, so we still get the same result. Now from BB16, we add in Victoria to the final 3, and I don't know where this goes. Obviously, I'm very inclined to still think Derek wins, though I do think there was some serious thought about certain people voting for Victoria. Not enough to give her to win, but I do think a Frankie could have been bitter enough to vote for Victoria. I do think a Caleb could have been bitter enough to vote for Victoria, but again, not enough to really change the result. This is another probably 6-2 vote where Derek gets 6, 2 to Cody, same votes that he got in the real scenario, but there are chances that it could have been a 4-2 vote or something to that nature, but again, I still think Derek wins this. Now from BB17, we have Steve and Liz. We add in Vanessa, and at this point, I'm pretty sure Vanessa wins this jury vote. Like, I know for sure if it's a final 2 between Steve and Vanessa, Vanessa wins. So I guess let's go through the votes. I mean, Shelly, I do think votes for Vanessa. This one's actually pretty tough because she was close to Steve as well. However, I do think she respected the game enough to vote for Vanessa. I do think Jackie is a Steve vote. Becky is a Vanessa vote. I do think Meg and James are Vanessa votes. So we're at 4-1-0 at this point. However, both Julia and Austin are Liz votes, which make it 4-2-1. And then we have Johnny Mac, who I do think is a Vanessa vote as well. So yeah, it should be a 5-2-1 vote, with Vanessa getting 5, Liz getting 2 from Austin and Julia, and then Steve getting 1 from Jackie. Now for BB18, where we have Nicole and Paul, we add in James, and this actually could be an interesting scenario here, as James does take away some votes from the other people. Again, let's run through jury votes one by one, as this could get kind of complicated. We do have Devon, who I do think in this scenario is still a Nicole vote. I think she did respect the game that Nicole played, so I do think she votes for Nicole. I do think Zakia is also a Nicole vote, along with Polly, who we might as well add in now as well. So Nicole has 3 locked votes right off the bat. And let's just add in Corey as well. Like, Nicole has 4 locked votes out of 8. So, I mean, that is a very good spot for her to start off with. Victor does vote for Paul. So Paul does get 1 vote. But then James probably gets the votes of Michelle and Natalie. I don't know where Bridget goes exactly. She probably goes Paul, as that's where she went originally, but I do think there's a chance she votes for James. But either way, that is a 4-2 vote where Nicole probably wins. And to be honest, there's probably not much of a chance for any other result either, as there's no real chance of the James and Paul votes to be coming together to go against Nicole. And I do think Victor was someone that was more likely to vote for Nicole than he was for James. So really, just overall, I don't really see a scenario where Nicole doesn't win this final 3, though it is kind of a wonky vote there. Now for BB19, where we have Josh versus Paul versus Christmas. And this is kind of an interesting vote. I am inclined to think that Josh still wins this jury vote. Obviously, the votes that were anti-Paul are still there. There are still 5 votes going against Paul in terms of Cody, Mark, Elena, Alex, and Jason. Those are 5 votes going against Paul. The question is where those votes go. I do think Paul still gets Matt, Raven, and Kevin. But again, it's those 5 votes that are deciding the game. I know some people say, oh, Christmas would have won. I'm inclined to still think Josh would have won. I do remember reading exit interviews immediately after the season where they said that Josh was their number 1 pick, which obviously implies that that was above Christmas. So I'm inclined to think that they still vote for Josh over Christmas, though, again, not 100% solid, but I do think that is the case. Now we're at BB20, and this one could be a bit all over the place as well. Obviously, we add in JC to the final 3, and JC was actually a pretty big jury threat. Now, again, let's run through the votes because I do think all 3 of these players gets votes. So first off, we start off with Bailey, who I do think is a locked Casey vote in that scenario. We do have Rockstar, who has admitted herself that she was considering voting for JC at the time. I do think she goes for JC. I do think there's a chance she still goes for Casey, but I am inclined to think she goes for JC, especially because a lot of her other allies were going for JC as well. And let's just get to those allies. Again, I think the Fessy, Scotty, and Haley contingent were voting JC, at least coming into that final round. I do think JC gets those 3 votes, at least coming into jury questioning. Again, like Tyler was able to convince Haley to flip her vote at the final jury questioning, which who knows if that still happens. But in this scenario, coming into that questioning, I do think those votes go to JC, which JC already has 4 votes out of the first 5. I do think Brett still votes for Tyler. I do think Angela still votes for Tyler. But to be honest, I think Sam goes for JC as well, which gives JC an overwhelming win here of a 5-2-1 vote, where Casey actually comes in last. Casey really only gets the vote of Bailey. Tyler gets Angela and Brett. JC gets every other vote. Again, there's a chance Haley flips due to this. She could vote for Tyler, but even then, JC still wins this jury vote. I do think JC was a pretty big jury threat on this season, and I do think he wins this scenario. Now for BB21, and obviously here we have Nicole Anthony joining Jackson and Holly, and I don't think this changes too much. I do think Jackson still wins. Again, there was that core majority group on the jury of Jack, Annalise, Christy, Tommy, and Nick. I do think they all still vote for Jackson. That's 5 votes for Jackson. He still wins. I do think Nicole gets the other 3 votes, though. I do think Jessica, Kat, and Cliff vote for Nicole Anthony. But again, I don't really see those 5 votes for Jackson flipping. I do think Jackson still solidly wins this jury vote. Now we're on the BB22, where we have Cody versus Enzo versus Nicole, and this could be interesting. Again, we've heard that Nicole could have gotten jury votes if she got to the end. And I do think Cody had some locked votes. I think Cody gets the votes of Ian, Davon, Tyler, and Danny. I think he has 4 locked votes there. However, I think Nicole could have gotten 4 votes as well. Nicole for sure gets Christmas. I do think she gets Memphis as well. The question is, where do Kevin and David land? Do they end up landing on Cody? Do they end up landing on Nicole? If they end up voting for Nicole, that means Enzo decides the winner. I do think in this scenario where Cody obviously doesn't have to cut Enzo or anything, I do think Enzo votes for Cody. I know Enzo talked about this, how he would have voted for Nicole, but that was under the assumption that Cody cut him. I do think Enzo just naturally votes for Cody in any other scenario. So I do think Cody still wins, but that's a very precarious spot for Cody to be in. Obviously, there's still the chance that David and Kevin vote for Cody, which I do think is still a likelihood. And through that, Cody still wins dominantly. But I think Nicole definitely had a path there to at least tying up the votes. So that's it for the main seasons of the show. Now we're moving on to the celebrity seasons. And these are kind of tough because at the Final Four HOH got to vote out 2 people. So with especially the first season here, this is kind of tough because I don't know who Marissa would have voted out if she could only vote out 1 person. Obviously, we had Ariadna and Mark as the 2 people she did vote out. So who does she vote out if she only votes out 1? I think for her own game, she votes out Mark. However, I could very likely see Ross convince her to vote out Ariadna. So we might as well talk about both scenarios, though I do think Ariadna was probably the person that Marissa would just naturally keep in the game. So first, let's talk about the Marissa, Ross, Ariadna final 3. I do think Ross still gets the votes from Mark, and I still think he gets Meta's vote. I do think the Brandy vote goes to Ariadna, and now the real question is, how many of the Marissa votes go to Ariadna at this point? I don't know, because I do know that like Marissa being a mother was like a major factor of why she got a lot of the jury votes that she did. But at the same time, the jury really didn't respect Ross and Marissa, so I could very much see Ariadna getting votes solely because she's not Ross or Marissa. Like, I do think Omarosa was someone that was probably an Ariadna vote in this situation. I could see Shannon being a champion for Ariadna in this situation. I think through them, those 2 are the 2 people that seem to care the most out of the jury. I do think they could flip the votes onto Ariadna, but I definitely don't think it's a guarantee. But I am inclined to think Ariadna is the winner in this scenario, though I don't think many of the jury votes are super solid in that. And if we add in Mark, I do think this changes in a different dynamic because I do think Mark wins against Ross in a final 2. But I do think having Marissa there as well really changes things as well, because I don't think Omarosa and Shannon were nearly as pro Mark as they would have been Ariadna. In this scenario, I do think Brandy keeps her votes on Ross, but then he loses the vote of Mark, so he probably still gets 2 votes. I do think Mark gets James' vote pretty easily. I do think he probably gets Chuck's vote. However, I do think at that point, a lot of the women are probably still going to vote for Marissa to win. Again, they were pretty pro-woman and also pro-mother, that sort of element of it. So I do think Keisha, Shannon, Omarosa, probably Ariadna as well do still vote for Marissa. But again, it's not really a guarantee. But I am inclined to think that more than likely Marissa beats Ross and Mark. And now for Celebrity Big Brother 2, where I think this one's a lot easier to guess. I mean, Ricky does win final HOH. I do think he easily votes out Dina over Lolo here, which means we get a final 3 of Tamar, Ricky, and Lolo. And the real question here is, how many votes does Lolo get? Because obviously we do see that Tamar beats Ricky unanimously. However, I do think Lolo gets some votes here, because I know that Tom Green was very pro Lolo at the time that he was voted out. So I do think Tom and Kato probably both give their votes to Lolo. Natalie obviously probably gives her vote to Lolo. But that's only 3 votes. I mean, we still have 5 other votes. I think Dina is really up in the air. I do think Joey, Ryan, and Jonathan are probably leaning Tamar. And then we have Candy, who I think is a pretty locked Tamar vote. So, I mean, that's 4 Tamar votes, 3 Lolo votes, and then a Dina vote that's kind of just up in the air. I do think she leans Tamar, though. So I do think Tamar is given the win in this scenario. But again, it's not unanimous like it was against just Ricky. But there we go. I mean, that is every final 2 in the history of Big Brother, talking about what would have happened if they were final 3s. And again, just like Survivor, I obviously have a decent amount of ideas for what if videos down the road that I would like to do at some point. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.